Smoke poured from chimneys across the mountain settlement, then stopped one by one as temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. By dawn, only Gideon Mullins' cabin still showed signs of life, its chimney wrapped in what looked like madness but functioned like genius. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival and forgotten wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just save your life in ways you never expected. The year was 1839, and the North Carolina mountains had already claimed 3 trappers that winter before Ephraim Combs became the 4th. Gideon Mullins had partnered with Ephraim for 5 seasons, working the beaver streams that fed into the French Broad River. They were competent men, careful men, the kind who checked their trap lines in pairs and never took unnecessary risks. But competence meant nothing against a danger they didn't understand. Their cabin sat in a narrow valley where 2 creeks converged, surrounded by hemlock and yellow poplar. They had built it the previous autumn using standard mountain methods. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and clay, a single door facing south, 1 small window, and a stone chimney on the north wall. The chimney had taken them 3 days to build, stacking flat rocks with mud mortar extending at 6 feet above the roof line. It drew well, kept the cabin warm, and seemed perfectly adequate for their needs. January 12th arrived with clear skies and dropping temperatures. By nightfall, the thermometer Gideon kept hanging on the cabin wall showed negative 20 degrees. By midnight, it had fallen to negative 25. The coldest night either man had experienced in the mountains. They kept the fire burning strong, feeding split oak and hickory into the stone fireplace. Around 2 in the morning, Gideon woke to the smell of smoke, not the clean smell of burning wood, but the acrid, choking smell of smoke that had nowhere to go. The cabin interior was hazy. Ephraim was coughing in his sleep. Gideon rose quickly, checking the fireplace. The fire burned well, flames strong and hot, but smoke was curling back into the room instead of rising up the chimney. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside into air so cold it burned his lungs. Walking around to the north wall, he looked up at the chimney top. No smoke was coming out. He could see frost forming around the opening, ice crystals catching moonlight. He returned inside to find Ephraim awake, standing by the door. "Chimney's blocked," Gideon said. "We need to put the fire out." Ephraim shook his head. "We'll freeze before morning. Keep it burning small. Crack the door for ventilation." It was the logical choice, the reasonable choice, the choice that killed him. They damped the fire down and opened the door 2 inches. Cold air rushed in, and some smoke drifted out. Ephraim lay back, down, pulling his blankets tight. Gideon sat by the door, trying to stay alert, but exhaustion and smoke inhalation worked against him. He woke at dawn to find Ephraim dead. Gideon buried Ephraim on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had set their best trap line. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 2 days to dig through it, breaking the earth with a pickaxe and removing chunks of frozen soil with a shovel. He wrapped Ephraim in both their blankets and marked the grave with stones stacked in a cairn. He spoke no words over the grave because words seemed inadequate against the silence of the mountains. He returned to the empty cabin and forced himself to examine what had killed his partner. The fire had gone out overnight after Gideon had fallen unconscious. When he revived in the frigid dawn and found Ephraim dead, his first instinct had been to start the fire again. He didn't. Instead, he climbed onto the roof using a ladder they kept for repairs. At the chimney top, he found his answer. The interior of the flue was coated with ice nearly 2 inches thick, reducing the opening to a hole barely 4 inches across. Not enough for proper draft. Not enough for smoke to escape. He spent the rest of that day studying the chimney. The exterior stones were covered in frost. When he touched them with his bare hand, they felt colder than the surrounding air. He built a small fire in the fireplace and watched what happened. Smoke rose initially, then began backing up as condensation formed inside the flue and immediately froze. The colder the exterior stone became, the faster the interior smoke condensed and turned to ice. Over the next 2 weeks, Gideon visited every trapper cabin within 10 miles. He found the same story everywhere. Chimneys that worked perfectly in moderate cold failed catastrophically when temperatures dropped below -20. Families had learned to manage the problem by keeping fires small during extreme cold, sleeping in shifts to monitor smoke levels, or simply extinguishing fires and huddling under every blanket they owned until temperatures rose. At Zachariah Sizemore's cabin, 8 miles east, Gideon found a man who had lost 2 cabins to chimney failure. The first had burned down when Zachariah tried to clear an ice blockage by building an extremely hot fire. The expansion cracked the stones, sparks escaped, and the roof caught fire. The second cabin had nearly killed his family when smoke backup caused his wife and 3 children to pass out. They survived only because Zachariah had been outside checking his horses and returned in time to drag them into open air. "It's the price of mountain winters," Zachariah said. They sat outside his current cabin, the third he had built, drinking coffee in weak February sunlight. You accept it or you leave. There's no fixing stone. Cold is cold. Smoke is smoke. You can't change how they work together. But Gideon couldn't accept it. Ephraim was, dead because of something that seemed preventable. Other men had nearly died. More would die in future winters unless someone solved the problem. He became obsessed with a question that apparently nobody else had asked. Why did the chimney fail? Most trappers thought the answer was obvious. Extreme cold caused smoke to freeze. Nothing could prevent it. But Gideon kept returning to what he had observed. The exterior stone became colder than the surrounding air. It was pulling heat away from the smoke before the smoke could exit. The stone itself was the problem. He spent late February and early March testing his theory. He touched the chimney exterior during fires, comparing it to wooden walls, to the air temperature, to other surfaces. The pattern held consistent. Stone conducted heat poorly, meaning it warmed slowly from the fire inside. But it also absorbed cold readily from the air outside. In extreme temperatures, the stone became so cold that smoke condensed and froze before reaching the top of the flue. The solution seemed obvious once he understood the problem. He needed to keep the exterior stone warm. But how? Spring thaw arrived in late March, bringing the end of trapping season. Gideon spent the final weeks working his lines alone, checking traps that he and Ephraim had set together. The work felt hollow without his partner, but it kept him moving and gave him time to think about chimneys and cold and solutions that might exist. By April, when he pulled his traps and prepared to leave the mountains, Gideon had accumulated 40 beaver pelts, 6 bear hides, and 2 buffalo robes. It was the best season he had experienced in 5 years. The pelts were prime quality, thick and lustrous. At market prices, they represented roughly $350. More money than most men earned in a full year of labor. Standard practice dictated his next move. Trappers left the mountains in spring, traveled to settlements like Asheville or Boone, sold their furs, spent several weeks enjoying civilization, then returned to the wilderness in early summer to prepare for the next season. The money from pelts paid for powder, lead, salt, coffee, flour, and whatever other supplies a man needed to survive another year. Gideon made the 3-day journey to Asheville with his furs packed on 2 horses. He reached the settlement on April 19th and went directly to Walker's trading post, the largest fur buyer in the region. James Walker examined Gideon's pelts with the eye of a man who had been in the business for 30 years. "Prime beaver," Walker said, running his hands through the fur. "I'll give you $5 each. The bear hides, 15 apiece. Buffalo robes, 50 each." He calculated on a piece of paper. $340 total. Gideon nodded. Then he asked a question that made Walker look at him strangely. If a man wanted to keep pelts for himself, use them for something other than selling, which would work best for insulation? Walker frowned. Insulation? You mean for clothing? For wrapping around a chimney? The trading post went quiet. 3 other trappers who had been examining goods turned to stare. Walker set down the beaver pelt he was holding. "You want to wrap a chimney in fur? To keep the stone warm. Prevent ice formation in the flue. One of the trappers laughed outright. Another shook his head and went back to examining knives. Walker's expression moved from confusion to something approaching pity. "Son, these pelts are worth $340. A chimney is just stacked stone. You'd be wrapping money around rocks." "Which furs would work best?" Gideon repeated. Walker sighed. "Beaver is dense and somewhat water-resistant. Bear provides thickness. Buffalo is heaviest insulation. But this is madness. You sell furs? You don't waste them on chimneys." Gideon gathered his pelts and left the trading post without selling a single one. Behind him, he heard laughter and conversation about "that fool Mullins who thinks chimneys need fur coats." He didn't care. He had his answer. Beaver for water resistance, bear for thickness, buffalo for maximum insulation. $350 in pelts versus his life and the lives of whoever else would listen. The choice seemed obvious. Gideon returned to the mountains in late April and selected a new cabin site 3 miles from where Ephraim had died. The location sat on higher ground with clear sight lines and better drainage. He began construction in early May, working alone for the first time in his trapping career. The solitude felt appropriate. This cabin would be different, built according to principles nobody else believed in. Standard cabin construction took 2 men roughly 12 days. Gideon gave himself 6 weeks and focused on the chimney with intensity that bordered on obsession. He gathered stones for 3 days, rejecting any that were irregular or porous. He wanted flat pieces that would stack tightly and hold mortar well. The selection process took him to a rocky outcrop 2 miles away, where he spent hours choosing individual stones and hauling them back in a canvas sling. The chimney itself rose slowly. Gideon built it 8 inches taller than normal practice dictated, reasoning that extra height would improve draft and extend the opening further above the roofline where ice might form. He used more mortar than necessary, filling every gap between stones until the joints were nearly waterproof. The exterior dimensions were slightly wider than standard construction, providing more surface area for the insulation he planned to apply. Other trappers passing through stopped to watch his progress. They commented on the excessive height, the careful stonework, the extra mortar. One man told him he was wasting effort on details that wouldn't matter. Another said the chimney looked like something a stonemason in town would build, not something a trapper needed. Gideon listened politely and continued working. By August, the cabin stood complete, except for the modification that would make it remarkable. Gideon began the wrapping process on August 23rd. He had spent the previous week preparing his pelts, soaking each one in a mixture of water and clay that he stirred in a large wooden bucket. The clay came from the creek bank, fine-grained and smooth. He worked it into the pelts until the leather backing was saturated, then hung them to dry in the sun. The clay treatment served a specific purpose. Once dried, it created a moisture barrier that would prevent rain and snow from penetrating the fur and reaching the stone chimney. Without this barrier, the pelts would absorb water, freeze solid in winter, and become useless dead weight. With it, they would remain flexible and functional. He started at the chimney base with beaver pelts, wrapping them fur side out and overlapping each piece like roof shingles. Leather strips cut from deer hide served as ties wrapped around the chimney and pulled tight. 20 beaver pelts covered the bottom 2/3 of the structure. Over these, he added 6 bear hides, their thickness providing a second insulation layer. Finally, on the north-facing side where wind and cold would strike hardest, he secured both buffalo robes. The top 18 inches remained unwrapped, leaving the opening clear for smoke. When finished, the chimney wore $350 in furs. His neighbors called it Mullins' Folly. September brought the first cold nights, temperatures dropping into the 20s. Gideon lit his first fire on September 15th and watched the chimney carefully. Smoke rose cleanly from the unwrapped top section, venting into clear mountain air without hesitation. He stepped outside and examined the hide-wrapped portion. The pelts showed no signs of moisture accumulation. The clay treatment had dried to a hard shell on the leather backing, creating exactly the barrier he had intended. But autumn cold was not the test that mattered. 20 degrees above zero posed no challenge to any chimney. Gideon needed to wait for the brutal temperatures that had killed Ephraim, the -20 and below conditions that caused standard chimneys to fail. Until then, his wrapped chimney proved nothing except that it looked unusual. Zechariah Sizemore visited in early October, riding up the valley with curiosity, overcoming his skepticism. He dismounted and walked around Gideon's cabin twice, studying the fur-wrapped chimney from every angle. Finally, he stopped and shook his head. "It'll rot," Zechariah said. "Come spring, those hides will be mildewed and falling apart. Moisture gets into fur. Fur holds moisture. Moisture breeds rot. You've wrapped your chimney in something that'll decay before winter ends." Gideon pointed to the clay-treated backing. "The clay seals it. Water can't penetrate to the leather. I tested it with a bucket of water. Poured it over a treated pelt. The fur shed the water like duck feathers. And when it freezes, ice will make those pelts rigid as boards. Dead weight on your chimney. Might even crack the stones." "Then I'll learn something," Gideon replied. Word of the wrapped chimney spread through the scattered trapping community. Men who heard about it had opinions. Some thought Gideon had gone mad with grief over Ephraim's death. Others considered it a wasteful experiment that would prove nothing. A few wondered if there might be something to the idea but weren't willing to risk valuable pelts to find out. The consensus settled on waiting to see what happened when real cold arrived. November brought the first serious test. Temperatures dropped to -10 on November 28th. Gideon kept his fire burning and monitored the chimney throughout the night. Smoke continued venting cleanly. He climbed onto the roof at dawn and examined the unwrapped top section. No ice had formed. The interior of the flue was clear and dry. He touched the hide-wrapped exterior. The buffalo robes on the north face showed frost on their outer fur. But underneath, where the hides met the stone, everything felt dry and slightly warm. The insulation was working. Heat from the fire was staying in the stone instead of radiating into cold air. The stone was staying warm enough that smoke passing through the flue remained gaseous rather than condensing. But critics remained unconvinced. -10 was cold, but it wasn't the extreme temperature that caused catastrophic failures. Zechariah spoke for many when he said, "Wait for 30 below, then we'll see if your expensive wrapping works or just looks peculiar." Gideon waited. December 20th arrived with conditions that old-timers recognized as dangerous. Clear skies, no wind, air so dry it cracked lips and made wood snap with brittleness. The kind of weather that preceded extreme cold. Gideon checked his firewood supply and found it adequate. He had split and stacked enough oak and hickory to last 2 weeks of constant burning. If the cold came, he would be ready. By December 22nd, the temperature had dropped to -20 degrees. Gideon kept his fire burning steadily and checked the chimney every few hours. Smoke vented cleanly, no ice formed at the opening. The hide wrapping showed frost on its exterior surface, but remained flexible underneath. Around the settlement, other cabins began showing problems. Smoke backed up into living spaces. Families opened doors and windows despite the cold, choosing frozen discomfort over suffocation. Zechariah Sizemore arrived at Gideon's cabin on December 23rd, leading his horse through snow that had drifted knee-deep in places. His face was wrapped in a scarf, only his eyes visible. "My chimney's blocked," he said when Gideon opened the door. "Can't keep a fire. Wife and children are at the Hendersons' place. I came to see if your wrapped chimney is still working." Gideon stepped aside. Smoke rose from his fireplace, drawn up the flue by perfect draft. The cabin was warm, comfortable, safe. Zechariah unwrapped his scarf and stood by the fire, absorbing heat. Through the window, they could see his cabin a half-mile down the valley. No smoke rose from its chimney. "How cold is it?" Gideon asked. -25 when I left, still dropping." They spent the evening watching other cabins in the visible distance. One by one, smoke stopped rising from chimneys. Families were making the choice between freezing and suffocating, extinguishing fires to prevent smoke backup, huddling under blankets in the hope that temperatures would rise before they died. Zechariah counted 7 cabins within sight. By nightfall, only Gideon's showed smoke. December 26th brought negative 30 degrees. Gideon woke before dawn and immediately checked his fire. Still burning well. He dressed in layers and went outside into air so cold it felt solid. Walking around to view the chimney from the north side, he saw frost covering the buffalo robes, but no ice at the opening. Smoke poured freely into the pre-dawn darkness, rising straight up in the still air. He touched the wrapped section carefully. The pelts were cold but not frozen rigid. He touched the unwrapped stone near the top. It was warm. Heat from the interior fire was reaching the top of the flue because the wrapped lower section was preventing heat loss along the way. The principle was working exactly as he had theorized. For 3 days, temperatures remained at or below negative 30. For 3 days, Gideon's fire never faltered. His chimney refused to freeze. Around him, the settlement went dark and cold and silent. When temperatures finally rose on December 29th, 7 families emerged from their cabins, half frozen but alive. January 5th brought temperatures back above zero for the first time in 2 weeks. Gideon left his cabin to check on neighbors, following packed snow trails between settlements. What he found made Ephraim's death feel less like isolated tragedy and more like predictable outcome of a problem everyone had accepted as unsolvable. The Henderson cabin housed 11 people. 3 families had crowded into a space meant for 4. They had kept a small fire burning despite smoke backup, choosing partial suffocation over freezing. Every face showed the gray pallor of carbon monoxide exposure. The children coughed continuously. The cabin interior was black with soot. At the Crawfords' place, Gideon found the family had abandoned their cabin entirely on December 27th. They had walked 4 miles to relatives in the lower valley, carrying 2 children and whatever possessions they could manage. The cabin stood empty, its chimney visibly blocked with ice, even from ground level. Zechariah Sizemore's situation was desperate. His chimney blockage had forced the family to extinguish their fire on December 23rd. They had survived 4 days, wrapped in every blanket, hide, and piece of clothing they owned, huddled together for shared warmth. His youngest daughter, age 6, had developed frostbite on 3 toes. His wife could barely speak, her throat damaged from breathing frigid air for extended periods. In total, 7 families within 10 miles had experienced chimney failures. 2 had maintained fires despite deadly smoke backup. 3 had extinguished fires and nearly frozen. 2 had abandoned their cabins. One trapper, a man named Elijah Sparks who lived alone, had nearly died from smoke inhalation identical to what killed Ephraim. His neighbor found him unconscious on his cabin floor and dragged him outside in time. Gideon spent the next 2 weeks helping families restore their chimneys to function. The process was dangerous and tedious. He boiled water in large pots, carried it up ladders, and poured it down blocked flues. The hot water melted ice, but the work had to be done carefully to avoid cracking cold stones, with thermal shock. Some chimneys required multiple treatments. The worst blockages took 3 days to clear. During this work, questions started. How had Gideon's chimney kept working? Why had his fire never failed? What was different about his setup? He explained the hide insulation principle in simple terms. Keep the exterior stone warm. Warm stone means smoke stays hot. Hot smoke doesn't condense and freeze. Ice can't form if condensation doesn't occur. Skeptics argued about cost. 40 beaver pelts represented $200. 6 bear hides were worth $90. Buffalo robes commanded $50 each, $350 total. Too much money to wrap around a chimney. Gideon's response was quiet but final. Ephraim Combs was worth more than $350. So is each of your families. Calculate the cost of rebuilding a cabin, or burying a child, or starting over after losing everything. Then tell me pelts are too expensive. Nobody responded. The silence held. Weight that arguments couldn't carry. Within days, Zechariah asked for help wrapping his chimney. Spring 1840 brought decisions that would define survival for the next decade. Trappers finishing the winter season faced a choice that previous generations had never considered: sell pelts for immediate profit, or invest them in infrastructure that might save lives. The question had no precedent in mountain culture, where cash money determined a man's success and pelts were currency. Zachariah Sizemore made his choice first. He had 30 beaver pelts from the season, 4 bear hides, and 1 buffalo robe. Market value approached $240. He asked Gideon to help wrap his chimney instead of taking the furs to Asheville. They worked together for 3 days in late April, soaking pelts in clay mixture, wrapping them around Zachariah's chimney in overlapping layers, securing everything with leather strips and rawhide thongs. When finished, Zachariah's chimney looked nearly identical to Gideon's. Word spread through methods that had no formal structure. Trappers talked at creek crossings. Families shared information at the occasional settlement gathering. Stories of the 30 below crisis traveled from cabin to cabin, carrying details about who had survived easily and who had nearly died. Gideon's name appeared in these stories, but so did descriptions of his wrapped chimney and explanations of why it worked. By summer 1840, 11 chimneys within 20 miles wore hide insulation. The specific materials varied based on what each trapper had available. Some used primarily beaver. Others mixed deer hides with bear. One family used nothing but deer because that was what the husband had taken during season. The insulation was less effective than Gideon's combination, but it was better than bare stone. Gideon shared his clay water treatment method with everyone who asked. He explained the importance of the moisture barrier, demonstrated how to apply the mixture, and emphasized that pelts needed complete saturation before drying. He accepted no payment for this advice. Knowledge that could save lives seemed like something that should move freely between people who needed it. The trading post in Asheville noticed the trend by midsummer. James Walker, who had mocked Gideon's idea a year earlier, commented to another trader that fur sales were down nearly 15%. More significantly, trappers were requesting leather straps, rawhide, and clay in quantities that suggested unusual projects. When Walker asked direct questions, trappers explained they were wrapping chimneys. Settlement elders initially viewed the practice with disapproval. Pelts represented wealth, trade goods, connection to markets in the East. Using them for cabin infrastructure seemed to violate proper economics. But families who had survived the 30 below crisis without catastrophe were difficult to argue against. Winter 1840 to 1841 brought validation. Temperatures dropped to -28 on January 10th. This time, 12 chimneys in the area continued venting cleanly throughout the cold. 0 deaths occurred from smoke inhalation. 0 families were forced to abandon their cabins. The contrast with previous winters was undeniable. By spring 1841, the practice had acquired names. Some called it Mullins wrapping. Others referred to pelt chimneys. The terminology mattered less than the adoption rate, which continued climbing. By 1842, hide-wrapped chimneys had become standard practice in high-elevation Appalachian settlements. The technique spread beyond the immediate area where Gideon trapped, carried by traveling hunters, visiting traders, and families relocating to new territories. Men who saw wrapped chimneys asked questions. Men who heard the survival stories from the 30 below winters adopted the method before building new cabins. Regional variations emerged as the practice spread across different communities. Wealthy settlers with access to buffalo robes used them exclusively, creating chimneys wrapped in the heaviest available insulation. Poor families made do with deer hides and rabbit pelts, which provided less protection but still improved performance compared to bare stone. Some trappers experimented with wool blankets treated with animal fat, creating waterproof insulation from materials easier to obtain than premium furs. Trading posts began selling what they called chimney pelt packages to new settlers. These bundles contained 20 to 30 assorted hides, leather strapping, and clay, priced slightly below market value for the individual components. The packages acknowledged that chimney insulation had moved from experimental oddity to accepted practice. Store owners who initially mocked the idea now profited from supplying it. The practice appeared in written records by 1845. Settler journals. and letters sent to family back east mentioned wrapped chimneys as notable features of mountain life. One letter from a North Carolina homesteader to his brother in Virginia described the technique in detail and credited it with keeping his family safe during a winter that killed livestock and damaged unprotected structures throughout the region. Winter 1845 brought the most severe test since the original 30-below crisis. Temperatures remained below -20 for 11 consecutive days in February. Communities with widespread chimney wrapping survived without casualties. Neighboring communities that had not adopted the practice lost 11 people to smoke inhalation and exposure. The statistical contrast made the innovation's value impossible to ignore. By 1850, historians estimate roughly 150 wrapped chimneys existed across the Appalachian region, from North Carolina through Virginia and into eastern Tennessee. The technique had become traditional knowledge, passed from experienced settlers to newcomers, from fathers to sons building their first cabins. The engineering principle behind it was understood broadly. Insulation prevents heat loss. Retained heat prevents condensation. No condensation means no ice formation. Gideon continued trapping through 1855, working alone and living simply. He was in his late 50s by then, still capable but slowing with age. Younger trappers sought him out occasionally, asking questions about chimney construction and winter survival. He welcomed them, shared what he knew, and never suggested that the knowledge originated with him. When pressed about the technique's development, he mentioned Ephraim's death and said he had learned from tragedy. He never profited from his innovation, never sought recognition, never claimed credit when others called wrapped chimneys by his name. The knowledge existed to be used, not owned. In Gideon's understanding, information that saved lives belonged to everyone who needed it, freely given because that was the only moral way knowledge could function. Gideon Mullins retired from trapping in 1856 at age 58. His body still functioned adequately, but the mountains demanded strength he no longer possessed with confidence. He built a small homestead in a valley near Asheville, choosing land with good water and southern exposure. The cabin he constructed featured, naturally, a hide-wrapped chimney using pelts from his final season. He married in 1857 a widow named Catherine, whose husband had died 3 years earlier. She brought 2 grown sons from her first marriage, men in their 20s, who helped work the farm. The arrangement suited everyone. Gideon gained family and assistance. Catherine gained security and partnership. The sons gained land and knowledge from a man who understood mountain survival. Younger trappers and settlers continued visiting throughout the 1860s, seeking advice on chimney construction. Gideon always welcomed them, explaining principles patiently, regardless of how many times he had answered the same questions. He demonstrated clay treatment methods, discussed pelt selection, and emphasized that the insulation needed to extend at least 2/3 of the chimney height for maximum effectiveness. When visitors asked how he had developed the technique, he told them about Ephraim Combs and the winter of 1839. He never embellished the story or claimed exceptional insight. He simply explained that watching his partner die from a preventable cause had forced him to question assumptions everyone else accepted. The solution had followed from understanding the problem. Nothing more complicated than that. By 1865, wrapped chimneys were considered old mountain wisdom. Newer settlers learned the practice from established families without knowing its origins. The technique had become absorbed into traditional knowledge, attributed to no particular person, and assumed to have existed for generations. Gideon found this appropriate. Good ideas should outlast their creators and function independently of credit or recognition. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1868 at age 70. Catherine found him on the morning of March 14th, still and cold but showing no signs of distress. The local minister performed a simple service. Gideon was buried in a small family cemetery on the homestead property. His gravestone, carved by Catherine's eldest son, read simply, Gideon Mullins, 1798 to 1868. He kept the smoke rising. Catherine maintained the homestead until her death in 1874. After that, the cabin stood empty for years. Travelers occasionally sheltered there during storms. The hide-wrapped chimney, now using pelts nearly 20 years old, still functioned when people built fires. The clay treatment had preserved the firs beyond normal expectations. Into the 1880s, older trappers told stories about Mullins and the wrapped chimney that changed mountain winters. The details varied with each telling, but the core remained consistent. One man's refusal to accept tragedy as inevitable had created knowledge that saved lives across 2 generations. The impossible had become routine, wrapped not in mystery, but in fur and secured with understanding. In high country, where winter still dropped to 30 below, chimneys kept smoking and families stayed warm, living proof that wisdom outlasts the men who discover it.